In this video, we will discuss about structured products ETF that actually pays over 10% dividend yield. So first of all, let me introduce you what is structured products ETF. So structured products ETF are basically a combination of stocks and derivatives, but I don't want to go much into that detail, but rather for basic understanding, what you have to learn is structured product ETFs basically implement a covered call strategy, and because of that, they actually offer a higher dividend yield. But one of the issues that comes up with the structured products ETF is though they offer a higher yield, but they limit the benefit from a potential rally in the stock. So what do we mean by this? It means, let's say if the market actually rallies about 10% or 15%. So in that case, these ETF will not gonna rally in the same line as with the market of about 10-15%. Rather, they will rally somewhere to the 5, 6, 7 or whatever it is, but the main point is they will not gonna grow in line with the market. Another thing I really have to discuss is the dividend. You also have to realize that though structured products ETF offer a higher dividend yield, but what are the tax implications? So for the structured products ETF, you basically have to look at the dividend in three components. So the number one is regular dividend, and the regular dividend is actually taxed at the qualified rate, which is the lower rate. Number two component is the dividend you actually earn from the covered call strategy, and this is the component of the dividend that is taxed at the ordinary rate, which is a higher rate as compared to the qualified rate. And the number third component that is basically a form of the dividend yield, it is the return of capital, and this return of capital is kind of treated as a deferred tax, which means the payment of the tax can be delayed in the future. Now that you got the basic understanding about the structured products ETF and how they differ from the regular dividend ETFs, let me jump into first of the structured products ETF. So the first structured product ETF that I actually selected for this video is called JP. When we look at the investment strategy of the JP, you will see it says that it is designed to provide current income while maintaining prospects for capital appreciation. And when you look at the last line, it also says it seeks to deliver a significant portion of returns associated with the S&P 500 index with less volatility in addition to monthly income. You have to realize what is the investment strategy of each of the fund or either any of the financial products. So in this case, so the goal of the JP is to offer higher dividend yield and potential of the capital appreciation with the less volatility. So that means when there's a less volatility, that means the movement with the market is going to be less, as we discussed in our earlier part when I was discussing about the basic understanding of this structured products ETFs. When we look at the stats of JP, we will notice that it's been launched in May of 2020. So it's been almost 5 years since this fund has been launched. Now when we look at the size, it has a quite healthy size of $41 billion of assets under management. Now look at the expense ratio. The expense ratio is about 0.35%. You have to realize that in the case of ETF, anything above 0.5% of the expense ratio is considered a bit expensive. But JP is 0.35%, which means it is less expensive as compared to the other ETFs. Now when we look at the dividend yield, it offers a dividend yield of 8.35% and it offers a monthly dividend yield. And when we look at the beta, it is 0.5, which is below 1, which means it is less volatile. So you can see the goal of the ETF is less volatility, and here we can see in terms of the number that the beta or the correlation with the market is less than 1, is only 0.57. Now when we look at the allocation of the JP, we will notice that it is basically broad diversified across different sectors, with the IT has been the dominant with the 16%, and financial is the next of around 14%, and then the industrials and others are about 13%. Now by looking at the top stocks in the JP portfolio, you will notice it's been tech dominant. So just look at the stocks in the JP, that is Oracle, Meta, Microsoft, MasterCard, Visa, Nvidia. All of them are actually tech related stocks. Now let's analyze the performance of the JP. So as you can see in the graph, the 1-year return of the JP is quite low as compared to the broad market, with the 6.7% for JP and 13.5% for the S&P 500. When we look at the return on the 3-year basis and the 5-year basis, you will still see the JP is below the broad market. And why? Because if you remember, the goal of this ETF is that it's not looking to outperform the market. Rather, it is looking for potential for the upside. Main goal is to give income and provide less volatility. And here we can see the investment strategy of this ETF into numbers. So when we look at the 1-year return and 3-year return and 5-year return, you will see the performance of JP is actually lagging as compared to the market. Why? Because it is being less volatile and the goal is to provide potential upside and not to outperform the market. And that's why the returns are actually lagging the overall market. Now again, when we look at the year-wise performance of JP, you can see again in 2021, the JP actually was 22% while the market actually was 29% of the return. And in 2022, interestingly, market declined 18% while JP only decreased 3%. And from 2023 onwards, you can still see the same trend that S&P 500 is basically outperforming the JP. My final thoughts on JP. So let's just first look at the pros. The pro is it is diversified, it is less volatile as compared to the broad market, it offers a higher dividend yield and a monthly dividend income. And it is the best option to be put into your Roth, which is a tax deferred account, because the dividend that you will receive from JP will not be taxed. Now we also have to discuss some of the cons of the JP. The number one con is limited track record. Number two is the capped upside potential. And number three is dividend might be taxed at a higher rate. Now moving on to a second ETF that's called JEPQ. So when we look at the investment strategy of JEPQ, you will notice that it is very similar to the JP. So it is basically to provide consistent income with lower volatility. But in the case of JEPQ, one difference is that the underlying exposure is of the Nasdaq 100. In the case of JP, it was the S&P 500. By looking at the stats of JEPQ, you will notice that it was formed in May of 2022. It's been only 3 years. Now, the size actually has become quite big, which is $28 billion of assets under management. And the most important thing is the expense ratio, which is just 0.35%, similar to JP. And when we look at the dividend yield, that is 11.52%. That is quite high as compared to the JP of 8.35%. And the other thing is the dividend payments are also monthly payments. When we look at the beta or the correlation with the market, that is 0.83. That is below 1 but still higher than the JP of 0.57. And the reason that is higher than the JP because it is providing exposure to the Nasdaq 100, which is tech dominant, and they are more volatile stocks. So when we look at the JEPQ sector allocation, you will notice that it is basically dominated by the IT of whopping 44%, and then the others are in line of 15% and down the line to almost 1% are negligible. Now we are looking at the top stocks in the JEPQ ETF. So you will notice that these are pretty dominant names in the IT sector, including Nvidia, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Broadcom, Alphabet, Meta, Netflix. So again, it's pretty dominated by the IT sector. So when we look at the performance of JEPQ, you will notice on the basis of 1 year, 3 year, and since inception, the returns of JEPQ have been consistently lower than the Nasdaq 100. And again, it is because of the overall strategy of the fund, which is to provide less volatility and provide more income and some capital appreciation. Now, on the basis of yearly return performance, you will notice that fund was launched in 2022, and in that year the market declined since May of 2022 almost 33%, while the JEPQ declined only 13%. But when we look at the return performance from 2023 onwards, and you will notice the returns of the JEPQ has been lagging the broad market. Again, it is because of the strategy of the ETF. My final thoughts on JEPQ. So let's first discuss about the pros. The pros are it offers a higher dividend yield, it offers a monthly dividend income, and it is best to put into tax deferred account such as your Roth because the higher dividend yield cannot be taxed outright. Now look at the cons. So the first is it is highly dominated by the tech sector. Then it also has the limited track record. Then it also has the capped upside potential, and the dividend might be taxed at a higher rate. Now the third one that I have selected, it is called SPYI. Now SPYI is a bit different as compared to JP and JEPQ, and the reason is because it is a bit tax efficient. Now let's look at the investment strategy of the SPYI. So when we look at the investment strategy of SPYI, you will notice that it seeks to provide high monthly income in a tax efficient manner. With the potential for upside appreciation in rising markets. So the key thing that you have to notice that basically makes a difference is the tax efficiency, which we haven't seen in the case of JP and JEPQ. Now I will discuss about the tax efficiency strategy of the SPYI. So SPYI basically uses call options in a covered call strategy, which qualify for favorable tax treatment under section 1256 contracts. So under this section, 60% of the gains made by the ETF are taxed at a long-term tax rate, which is definitely a lower tax rate, while 40% of the gains are taxed at a short-term tax rate, which is a high rate. Now another thing which is also as a part of efficient strategy is a substantial portion of the distribution is in the form of repayment of invested capital, which basically defers the tax liability. So that is the tax efficient strategy of the SPYI. Now, when we look at the stats of SPYI, we will notice that it's been formed in August of 2022. So it's relatively new fund. Now the size is about $4 billion. Now look at the expense ratio, and you will notice a quite increase, which is 0.68%. Now when we look at the dividend yield, that is quite high of 12.65% and is paid on a monthly basis. And the last is the beta, which is about 0.79. Let's look at the sector allocation of the SPYI. So when we look at the sector allocation of SPYI, you will notice that 1/3 of the exposure is to the technology sector, and then the second is the financials with 14%, and then the consumer cyclical of 11%, and then the communication of about 10%. Now when we look at the top stocks in the SPYI, you will notice that these are again dominated by the IT sector, such as Nvidia, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Meta. When we look at the performance of SPYI, you will notice that 1-year return of the SPYI has been about 12%, while the market actually gave off around 14%. And when you look at the since inception basis return, that is 12% for the SPYI and about 17% for the S&P 500. Again, it is not trying to outperform the market, but provides a capital appreciation. So again, when we look at the performance on the yearly basis, we will notice that during the year of 2022, in which the fund was launched, it declined only 2%, while the market actually declined 18%. And during the period of 2023 and onwards, you will notice that SPYI basically underperformed the overall market, and now you must know the reason. Because of the investment strategy of the ETF. My final thoughts on the SPYI. So the pros, it offers a higher dividend yield and it offers a monthly dividend income, and the most important thing is the dividend are in a tax efficient manner, which we haven't seen in the case of JP and JEPQ. The cons of the SPYI is basically limited track record, it has a quite high expense ratio, and it has a limited upside potential. Now moving on to a fourth ETF. This ETF is known as QQI. So let's look at the QQI. So first thing first, just look at the investment strategy. So the investment strategy of the QQI is basically to provide high monthly income in a tax efficient manner with the potential for equity appreciation. But the difference between the QQI and SPYI is QQI basically provide exposure of the Nasdaq 100, while SPYI basically providing exposure of the S&P 500. QQI also offers the same tax efficient strategy as it is offered by the SPYI, which is the section 1256. Now let's look at the stats of the QQI. The fund has been launched in Jan of 2024, so it's been almost 1.5 years. And look at the size is about $2.6 billion. Now let's look at the expense ratio. The expense ratio is 0.68%, that is in line with the SPYI. But look at the dividend yield. The dividend yield is actually higher than the SPYI, and the dividend yield for the QQI is 14.69% paid on a monthly basis. Since the fund is pretty new, so we don't have the beta for this fund. Now let's look at the sector allocation of the QQI. And the first thing that you will notice is the exposure to the technology sector, which is over 50%. And then rest of them, communication, consumer, cyclical, these are roughly 15-16%. And then rest of them are actually below 10%. Now, when we look at the top stocks in the QQI, you will notice that these are actually from the tech sector. When we look at the performance of the QQI, though it's been launched in 1.5 years, so it doesn't have a long track record, but you can see even in this case, on the basis of 1 year and since inception, the returns of the QQI basically are underperforming the broad market because of the stated investment strategy of this ETF. And final thoughts on the QQI. So let's just look at the pros. The pros are actually basically it offers a higher dividend yield and it offers a monthly dividend income. And it also offers the dividend in a tax efficient manner. Now let's look at the cons. The cons of the QQI is basically quite tech focused. It has a very limited track record. It has a quite high expense ratio and it also has a limited upside potential. Now moving to a fifth high paying dividend ETF. That is called IWMI. Let's just look at the investment strategy of IWMI. So when we look at the investment strategy, we will notice that it seeks to provide high monthly income again in a tax efficient manner with the potential for equity appreciation. Now you have to notice in the case of IWMI, it is providing an exposure of the Russell 2000 index. Now let's jump to a stats of the IWMI. So you will notice first thing is that it has been launched in June of 2024. So almost 1 year. The size is also pretty small, which is just $206 million. Now let's look at the expense ratio. And the expense ratio of IWMI is 0.78%, even higher than the SPYI and the QQI. But look at the dividend yield. The dividend yield is also high, which is 15.22% to be precise. And the payment is also on a monthly basis. Moving on to a sector allocation of IWMI. And you will notice that it has a quite different sector allocation from the rest of the ETFs that we discussed earlier. So it has a biggest exposure to financials of 18%. Then the second is healthcare of 17%. Then industrials of 16% and technology of 15%. And then rest of them are actually less than 10%. So this IWMI has a pretty diverse exposure to different sectors. Final thoughts on IWMI. So the pros of the IWMI, it offers again a pretty high dividend yield of over 15% and it is paid on a monthly basis and that dividend is also in a tax efficient manner. And the cons are basically it has a very limited track record because it was launched in just June of 2024. It has a pretty high expense ratio and it also has the limited upside potential. Now moving to our last ETF, that is called OMAH. Now, if you are a fan of Warren Buffett and you want to invest in the same stocks as Warren Buffett has invested, then this ETF is best for you because this ETF basically invests into stocks which Warren Buffett has selected for his own portfolio. But this ETF also offers a dividend yield of 15% in a tax efficient manner. Now, look at the stats of the OMAH. So you will notice first thing is the OMAH is also a very new fund that's been launched in March of 2025. And the size is pretty small. It is just $328 million. Now look at the expense ratio. It has shot up to 0.95%. That is highest as compared to the rest of ETF that we have discussed. Now look at the dividend yield. The dividend yield is 15% and the payment is on a monthly basis. Now look at the sector allocation of OAMH. The OMAH is actually pretty dominated by the financials of 45% allocation. Now the next is consumer defensive of 18%. Now when we look at the third sector in the OMH, you will notice that technology is the third one with the allocation of 15%. And that is quite different as compared to rest of the ETF that we discussed. The technology sector was either at the first or in the second position. Now when we look at the top stocks OMAH, we will notice that these are the stocks that are also in the portfolio of the Warren Buffett. And the first one in the OMH ETF is the Berkshire Hathaway with 10% allocation. The next is Apple with 8%, American Express 7%, Kroger of 6%, and then VeriSign and Devita and rest of them around 5% and so on. Now, final thoughts OMH. So the pros of OMH, it's basically provide exposure to Berkshire Hathaway portfolio stocks. When we look at the pros of OMH, the first is exposure to Berkshire Hathaway portfolio stocks. Number two, it offers a higher dividend yield on a monthly basis. And then you have the tax efficiency factor also in the OAMH ETF. When we look at the cons of the OMH, the first is a very limited track record because it was launched only in March of 2024. The second is substantially high expense ratio of 0.95% as compared to the rest of ETF that we discussed in this video. Then again, it has a limited upside potential. And the last one is the concentration risk because this ETF has exposure to roughly 21 stocks. Now that we have understood about structured products ETF and have discussed about different aspects of high dividend paying ETF, let's look at them in comparison to see which one you should select for your own investment goal and your own investment risk and return criteria. Now, when we are comparing these different ETF, we have to look at their different aspects such as their inception time, their size, their expense ratio, their dividend yield, their tax advantages, their diversification. So if you are looking for ETF that offers a higher dividend yield, has a good expense ratio, also provide tax advantage and has a broad diversification, then you can look at the SPYI because it has almost everything. It has a dividend yield of about 12.7%, expense ratio of 0.68%, that is quite high compared to JP and JPQ, but it offers a tax advantage and it also offers a diversification. Now here in comparison, you can see the JP and JPQ as compared to SPYI, QQI and IWMI, that though JP and JPQ offer a higher dividend yield, but their dividend yield is actually not offering any tax advantage. So overall, it will be better to invest into SPYI, QQI and IWMI based on your investment goal and your own risk and return criteria. If you are a fan of Warren Buffett, but you also want to make some good dividend yield, then you can also consider OMAH because it is providing an exposure to the stocks basically selected by none other than Warren Buffett, and it also offers a dividend yield of 15%. But you also have to keep in mind that it has the highest expense ratio of 0.95%. So if you like the video, please hit the like and subscribe button.